Pull up those sleeves, check those clocks. Shorthand says a time, longhand says to think. So, Chris, I think it's a time for us to think.
Yeah, it is. The second hand just actually passed the hour mark for me as well.
So we're right on time.
Yeah, we're right on time.
Wherever you are.
Right on time is 10:02 a.m. or 10:03. It's tough for me to tell with this.
Because it turns off.
It turns off. Yeah.
Wow. My watch doesn't turn off. I went to a dumb watch.
Yes, you did.
And it just stays on.
Yeah.
And by on, it doesn't. It's on or off.
Do you have to
really.
wind your watch up, Josh?
No, so I had a bit of an adult purchase. If you're following the watch journey, the last time we talked, I said I had a cheap watch that was kind of a stand-in. I was trying to figure out, do I want to make the move from smartwatch to dumb watch? Mm-hmm. Do I like the look of it? Do I like having something on my wrist where I can tell time but not be bombarded by notifications?
Absolutely.
And I passed the test. I got a little coin for Christmas, and so I invested in, it's called an Eco Drive.
Yes,
that does
I have one as well. Yeah.
The atomic time. So pulled that bad
it charges
boy.
by light.
Is that how it does?
Yeah. So Citizen Eco Drive uses light to charge up. It's pretty fantastic.
Well, then we should start recording the podcast in the sun so that my watch can stay charged.
You can charge the computer that way too.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of some cheesy joke about how Christians also stay charged in the sun.
Oh, boy.
That was not very thoughtful. This is a time to think. This is Josh Holland, pastor of Downtown Mission Church in Wausau, alongside Chris Tillman.
Hello.
Pastor of Downtown Mission Church in Stevens Point. This is us combining our forces, meager and feeble as those forces might be.
But together, it's beautiful
Average.
and strong.
This is our attempt to help disciple the minds of people primarily in our congregation, but also people tangential to our congregation. We hope particularly this series called This Old Book will be helpful not only for people in our midst, but also people who are friends of, neighbors of, people in our church. And this podcast started years ago and has had different iterations, but the core of it has been an intent to have thoughtful and careful engagement with issues in the culture and the church, because if you got a Facebook feed, if you've been on Twitter before, if TikTok, I hear the youths are using TikTok.
If you've ever been on MySpace.
Sometimes people will post these minute-and-a-half TikTok videos debunking Christianity, which you can totally do in a minute and a half.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course.
So we go to TikTok for information now, too, and all of those venues really promote unthoughtful, uncareful, passionate, reactional engagement to issues in the culture church. Yeah. And we want to be boring.
You know what's ironic, Josh?
Everything.
TikTok. You think the clock goes tick-tock, tick-tock.
Wow, this is deep.
Tick-tock. But, you max out at like 30 to 90 seconds for a TikTok video. So it's pretty minimal TikToking. Yeah. We're actually TikToking for much longer.
Wow, you've heard of TikTok, but this is the real TikTok.
Yeah,
on the
clock.
You're
TikToking all the way through a 45-minute conversation with two mediocre men.
Can we say that we promote thoughtful, careful engagement and then devolve into just saying TikTok, TikTok, TikTok? Have you seen The Hunger Games?
Of course I've seen
There's that woman who kind of is out of her mind and she keeps just saying TikTok,
oh, sure.
TikTok.
Yeah.
Like that's what we just devolved into.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Well, welcome to TikTok. The clock strikes a time to think, and we are in a series called This Old Book. We are talking about a new book that has to do with this old book. This old book. Yeah.
Newish book.
Yeah, new, if you're comparing the Bible to another book, it's a very new book. The Heresy of Orthodoxy, written by Andreas Kostenberger and Michael Kruger. If you follow this...
That's Kruger from Kruger Industrial Smoothing.
What?
If anybody has seen Seinfeld, they know where it's from.
You're in a Seinfeld kick, aren't you? Because that's like the third reference in 2 days that I've heard.
I'm always in a Seinfeld kick. I love the show.
So Kruger, not from whatever Chris just said, but from Reformed Theological Seminary, and Andreas Kostenberger, is he at one of the Baptist ones?
I think he's at Southeastern.
Okay, yeah, so you got a Presby and a Baptist working together on this. Yeah. And they are together dealing with the claims of Walter Bauer, a scholar, and Bart Ehrman, a popular author and speaker, who are part of this modern move to try to persuade people to say dogma is not good, rigidity in doctrine is not good. Really, if we look at the early church, there was a lot of different beliefs. And the only reason we think one belief is the right belief is because those people that say they have the right belief were more powerful. They won out.
Palpatine won.
Yes. Palpatine.
Palpatine. Yeah.
And so that's the basic thesis dumbed down, is the only reason we have a thing called orthodoxy is because one group was able to win out over other equally valid groups. Now, here's the key. Kruger has made the point that no one debates that there are different belief systems. But the modern time extends that to say, because there are different belief systems, therefore they are all valid. And so you have this move to say it's not just that there were different people claiming to be Christians, but because there were different people claiming to be Christians, they all should validly be considered Christians.
Right.
That's where we want to pause and say, there is, like I had this analogy, Chris. Let's say that you were the only person in the world named Chris, right?
Yeah. Wow.
Utterly unique, right?
Wow.
And then all of a sudden, like 10 people show up and they're like, hey, I'm Chris. And I'm going, no, this is Chris. And then a third person says, hey, I'm Chris. And a fourth person, hey, I'm Chris. And we know, everyone knows there's only one Chris in the world. But now you've got 10 people saying, hey, I'm Chris. It wouldn't do to say, well, I guess there's 10 Chris's. Like, we know there's only one Chris in this hypothetical. And that's kind of what's happening with this idea of early Christianities is there was a form that was unified, passed down, connected to the Old Testament, preached by the apostles, called Christianity, from eyewitnesses and close followers of Jesus, and then other splinter forms came up and said, no, we're Christianity, and all of a sudden modern scholars are going, see, everyone's Christianity, everyone's Chris. Right? Is that analogy helpful at all? You like analogies?
Yeah, I love analogies so much. It is definitely, I would say, before we really get into details here, I mean, it is a reflection of a culture that values pluralism in many forms, right? So any truth claims are generally attached to somebody's genuineness of belief. It's attached to the validity of the fact that a plurality of thought is a good thing, right? So, that it's interesting that in this discussion of what is authentic to the early church, we're importing ideas that are pretty specific to 21st century Western culture. Because if you go to Africa, and you encounter an African and you make statements like, hey, whatever your truth is, your neighbor's truth is just as valid. They'll look at you in the face, as they rightly should, and say, you're crazy. You're ridiculous. So it's a reflection of culture, but that is where we find ourselves in this particular book.
That's one of the more helpful things I thought Tim Keller pointed out during his ministry was that if you... like that modern culture values diversity when it comes to food and dance and clothing. They say, hey, New York says, we're so diverse. Look at the restaurants we have. Look at the expressions of art we have. But when it comes to religious thought, the modern person still typically says, if this scenario, whoa, that's a new word.
Scenario.
This scenario happens,
that's an Italian word, isn't it?
You go to find someone in what we would consider, a third world country, or just someone not in the Western world. Not all countries in the Western world are third world. But you would say, hey, gender is a spectrum. And they say, well, no, that's ridiculous. Then modern people would still say, you just don't know.
You're backwards. Right, yeah.
And so when it comes to Enlightenment level thinking, modern people don't actually value diversity in that way. Yeah. And he would go so far as to say, isn't that ethnocentric? That you would believe that their beliefs are invalid? And he would be able to play people against their own philosophy in that way because we value pluralism to a degree. We value pluralism when it's helpful. And now, Chris, before we get into the topic of chapter 2, which is admittedly a little more historical and data pointy than some of the other conversations will be, but it'll be helpful. Before we get there, I didn't tell you what I did yesterday, did I?
You got up, right? You woke up yesterday?
Well, yeah, probably pretty good odds that I did that.
We saw each other on Monday night.
Yeah, but you didn't see me yesterday.
I didn't see you go to sleep, though, on Monday, so there's potential you just stayed up all day.
That is true. Yeah. You know what I did? I listened to Bart Ehrman.
Okay.
I said to myself, I'm spending a lot of time writing down notes of people that say, well, Ehrman says this, Bauer says this, and they say they're wrong for saying that. And I just start to feel a little bit like, let me make sure that Ehrman actually says it.
Yeah.
Right? That's a good move. If someone says so-and-so says this, and you have access to what they said, see if they actually said it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so one of the things that was said in chapter 2 of Heresy of Orthodoxy was that Bart Ehrman has this book, Lost Christianities, and he makes a claim that it sounds pretty ludicrous, which is...
Luda!
There were as many forms of Christianity as people during the early church.
Oof.
Now that's bonkers
So
to say.
right from the horse's mouth.
And so I says to myself, well, I wonder if he actually said it. So I went on YouTube and searched, and he's got a lecture probably 10, 15 years ago on lost Christianities, and I listened to it. And without getting into the content, you know what I thought, Chris?
What'd you think, Josh?
He's kind of funny.
Okay.
He's got pretty good pacing with his jokes.
Okay.
He's kind of nerdy, quirky, unassuming,
Okay.
not angry, seems endearing at times.
Interesting.
And I found myself going, it's a good reminder that even people who have bad or even evil ideas, that doesn't mean that the person you see espousing them is vitriolic. Or it doesn't, and that can be a little bit of how we
Devouring
think. We're
human
like,
flesh.
how could a person say this thing? And we build it up. And it almost, I remember a friend of mine saying that he kind of grew up because of the fundamentalist bent of his conservative church, thinking that essentially if he met a gay person, they would probably be the most evil outward person that he'd ever met. And he had to kind of come to this wrestling process of what it meant to actually be around people who were genuinely kind in certain areas of their life, seemed like normal people, represented on TV shows, but still operating in an ungodly sexual ethic.
Right.
So I was corrected a little bit just to say, look, we're going to be debating what Ehrman says, and I think what Ehrman says is really problematic.
Yep.
But we do have to remember that doesn't always mean the person that is saying these things we're going to see as abundantly evil outwardly, right?
Yeah.
I wonder, do you have any reflections on how is that a correction for how we debate ideas? Is it just something to have in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to, R.C. Sproul would talk about the consequences of ideas. And, I run into this sometimes just as a pastor when I might be thinking about churches or other pastors even that I would disagree with on important points, important doctrinal points. And then, you rub shoulders with them, you're around them, you might talk to them, and you're like, kind of feel like a jerk because I've been uncharitable toward them. And so I think there is a point at which the Christian has to ask the question about, the difference between being uncharitable toward a person, uncharitable toward the ideas that person promotes. But that being said, I think, as far as what Bart Ehrman has been advocating, it's been incredibly destructive.
Sure.
So, if you do encounter Bart Ehrman, give him a handshake, say, hey.
And tell him to stop it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there is something to be said for, there are two commands that we find in Scripture when it comes to dealing with people that are teaching falsely. One of them is have nothing to do with them. Another one is correct them with gentleness.
Sure.
And so how do you determine what spot you're at in that process if somebody is completely resistant to correction, or if somebody has, determined that maybe this is up for debate? Now, in Bart Ehrman's case, he's completely...
What is the proverb? Answer, and they're back-to-back. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest he be like him.
Yeah.
And you go, well, when do I answer a fool? It's like, well, figure it
out.
Right? And so just like, when do I correct with gentleness? When do I have nothing to do?
Right.
Pray about it. Exercise wisdom, seek godly counsel.
Yeah. So maybe it's just a good caution for people to think, yes, in a podcast format where we're constantly talking about ideas and people who espouse those ideas, to be clear, we're not, assessing these individuals as though somehow every other action they're committing is intended to, murder and destroy. But it is to say that, and I guess maybe this puts a little bit more of an ominous bent to this point, is to say that, I guess here we go.
Here we go.
I'm going to quote Michael Scott, quoting Scripture, and
quoting Wayne Gretzky.
Where he's in the conference room and says something to about Toby, and says like, even Satan, appears like an angel of light basically. And so, he flips the script on Toby, and Toby's like, okay, well, I mean, that's like, gotcha. Like, you actually just admitted to it, whatever. So, Bart Ehrman, sure, he's a nice guy. At the same time, his ideas are seriously dangerous, and they undermine the confidence of the people of God in the scriptures. And so I think if we can just hold those two things at the same time and say, yes, people that we disagree with can be nice individuals, and people we disagree with may say things that are horribly problematic. So, yeah.
Yeah, and another possible correction might be I listened to him and thought, I think it makes sense why someone would sit in that room, because it was probably 50 people or so in that room, and I thought, it makes sense why someone would listen to that room and nod their head and think this seems right. Yeah. He seems like he's got historical evidence. He doesn't seem mean. He's kind of funny. Yeah. And there's a way in which, do you remember the Sophists?
I wasn't there for them, but yes, I do.
Well, I mean, you always tell me how old you are, so I figured you might have just been there for the Sophists. The Sophists were known for essentially saying nothing beautifully, right? And Ehrman is not saying nothing, but the Sophists were like, we can win an audience simply by speaking wonderfully. And that is a danger of speech. You could run for president that way even. Is that you can couch no idea or bad ideas with good speech. Yeah. And so just for the Christian to know that just because something seems right or sounds genuine doesn't mean that it is at its core helpful or good or right or true. Let's dig into some of the topics here. Basically so chapter 2 seems to be broken down into two sections. The first section is saying Walter Bauer, who precedes Bart Ehrman, Walter Bauer says there's basically 5 cultural sites in the 2nd century where we have evidences from that prove that heresy preceded orthodoxy, meaning there was multiplicity of viewpoints, and it wasn't until later on that this multiplicity was squelched by the winning group. And so chapter 2 starts by going site by site to say, is this actually true? Sites like Edessa, which I believe is in Greece, sites like Asia Minor, Rome. And so it kind of goes through these arguments. And so we'll talk about a couple of them because I think they draw us to a helpful point.
Welcome to Geography with Pastors Josh and Chris.
Geography. So here's one that comes to mind. Bauer claims that in one site called Edessa, Marcionism, which is a viewpoint that seeks to separate the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament. God of the Old Testament, bad, angry, judgmental. God of the New Testament, nice, kind, sacrificial. Therefore, two different gods. There's a stark separation, which is very counter to the scriptural witness that Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament, right? Bauer claims that in Edessa, Marcionism preceded orthodoxy. Now, here's just where the historical nature is helpful to evaluate that claim. Kruger and Kostenberger say, okay, is it likely that Marcionism came before what we know today as orthodoxy? Well, if that's true, Jesus died in the 30s AD. Marcion was excommunicated from Rome in the 140s AD. Generally, how ideas like this happen, Calvinism was developed after Calvin died. Arminianism was developed from followers of Arminius, right? So the followers developed the idea, and so it's probable that Marcionism developed sometime after he was excommunicated, so probably in the 150s AD, where Kostenberger and Kruger say, is it likely that for over 100 years there was no Orthodox Christian witness in Greece? That's the basic question, is if you're going to claim that this illegitimate belief system, Marcionism, illegitimate from our angle, legitimate from Bauer's angle, if you're going to claim that Marcionism was a contemporary, it was a viable alternative belief, it was part of a diversity of belief systems, then is it plausible to say somehow this site was untouched by witness of the most dramatic event in the ancient Near East for over 100 years? Well, Kostenberger and Kruger basically say, no, that's unlikely. Jews and Christians were in constant contact in the early church. though Edessa is far away, it was close to Antioch. So people who were influenced from Jerusalem to Antioch could have
Sure.
been influenced from Antioch to Edessa. And so they basically say it is highly unlikely that Marcionism was preceding Orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
So all that sums up to say someone made a claim. It's probable that Marcionism was there, and the claim was just not likely.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about this before, that oftentimes liberal, not politically liberal, but liberalism with the scriptures, which is some effort to undermine the authority of the scriptures is
Right.
generally what liberalism is. Liberalism is often founded on a couple different highly unlikely things that need to happen. We talked about this
Sure.
with debates on 1 Timothy 2, where it was like, well, maybe the women were uneducated, and maybe there was the cult of Artemis, and then you look at Acts 19, it's like, well, the cult of Artemis was led by men who were profiting, so it's highly unlikely that.
Right.
But the argument is based on 6 highly unlikely things. And so really what the historical evidence is of chapter 2 in Heresy of Orthodoxy are saying is at least don't give a lot of weight to an argument based on highly unlikely things. Any reflections on how maybe we're not in a data-driven historical validity, like everyone super cares about the evidences from Edessa in Greece, but how do we as Christians view even just that small sample size? Someone makes a claim.
Yeah.
It's either not verifiable at all, or it's debunked with the verification we have. How do we approach that?
Yeah, so the appeal, I think, for people is so as human beings, we tend to gravitate toward things that seem unique in a way that might provide new information, right? So I remember as a kid watching, it was like this old show hosted by Leonard Nimoy. I don't even remember what the name of it was, but it was effectively going through these like, spooky or urban legend myth type things like Bigfoot and whatever. And you'd watch the show and you would kind of hang on for a half hour, an hour, and you'd be thinking, okay, what new information am I going to get here that's going to be unique for me? I'm going to think like, okay, other people, they don't know about this, but I'm going to find out about Bigfoot. Like I'm going to get unique information about Bigfoot here. And I think the draw for people with things like what you mentioned, it has to do with the fact that we're like, okay, well, I can get some unique information. This is always the draw with Gnosticism generally, going into a stream of thought that, Bart Ehrman would say was a legitimate, alternative to what we consider orthodoxy, is that, if I can just get some new information, if I can just piece together some things, then I'm going to get the real story. I'm going to get the full picture. So
you can either feel humiliated if you didn't know something, or you can feel excited that you now know what you didn't know. You can say, oh, I didn't know that, but I now do know that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, the thing is, just to, I guess, provide a brief dismantling of that, if anybody might be stumbling over it, because I think it's pretty weak. Do you really believe that a location, quite a distance by ancient Near Eastern standards, is going to somehow have unique depository of information regarding because I think what's lost in this is that Bauer and Ehrman subscribe to what I would say is the, tired pattern of 19th century liberal theology, which is historical theology doesn't actually matter. Their belief structure, they're providing historical arguments for a Jesus that they don't believe can be historically understood or verified. And so it's a really backwards way of doing things, because they're saying, well, you can't trust historical records, but we're going to give you historical records to show you that what you should believe is actually maybe this, but you can believe what you want.
You can't trust some historical records, because the move that's made is there is bias in the historical records we do have in the New Testament, and that's going to be proving that. I think Kruger says having a conviction about what is true is not the same as being subjective. Sure. So being convinced by the data that something is true does not equal the same bias as subjectively believing something's true
Correct.
without data.
Correct.
You might each one of them might be believing something's true, but conviction based on logic, reason, evidence,
Right.
yada 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 is more conviction than it is bias. Now the move that kind of is made by modern thinkers is to say, here's our unbiased opinion on the historical data,
Right. Because we are
unlike
historians.
John the Apostle,
Right.
who had a super biased opinion on
Right.
this, right? We have no skin in the game. And Ehrman, for all his kind of endearingness, would say things like, look, I'm not here to tell you which gospel
Right.
is right. I'm just here to tell you there were many of them, which means some of them are wrong. And so he's trying to say, I am removed, I am neutral, I am unbiased. Really, the Apostle Paul, unlike me, had skin in the game. One more site.
Well, and let me just, I guess, piggyback off that
No.
real quickly.
Please.
Is to ask the question, why would they have bias? Why would the Apostle Paul be willing to be beheaded? Why
Sure.
would the Apostle John be willing to be exiled? Why would the Apostle Peter be willing to be
Ehrman's not
crucified
getting
upside
beheaded
down?
for this.
Right, exactly. He's
Yeah.
making money off of this. And hand over fist, he's making money over this.
Yeah.
And so you're thinking, okay, what makes more sense? A group of men and women 2,000 years ago who risked and gave life and limb for the sake of something that we have recorded historically for the past 2,000 years as this is the reasoning, this is the rationale why people were willing to give their lives for one that they viewed as God in the flesh, dying and rising from the dead, literally, historically, physically. Or does it make more sense for us to think, okay, a guy operating 2,000 years later who has an entire cultural ethos that he's imbibed and he is playing into is unbiased?
Right.
So it's like, all right, you have somebody working counterculturally, giving life and limb 2,000 years ago for the sake of something that we can look back and say, this is what we historically believed. Or somebody who says, well, this isn't actually what it was historically believed. Trust me because I am echoing the culture. It just makes no sense.
It's a lack of acknowledgement. I think this is something I listened to Ehrman yesterday, where as he would talk about the Orthodox group being the group that won, the Orthodox group that really we only care about who is right because it was the Orthodox who cared about who was right, and they proved that they were right and they won. My question was like, why would the message of the New Testament have had enough sway to get a big enough group to feel that they
Correct.
won out? Like the message of the New Testament of a bloodied king who has risen from the dead in order that his followers might be saved by his sacrificial life and then be persecuted for his name. Like what part of that was culturally accepted?
Right.
And even Ehrman, he admits the big distinction between what we now call orthodoxy and the culture in which Jesus came was that paganism, just have another God.
Correct.
As long as it doesn't trump Caesar, just have another God. And so Ehrman goes so far to say how basically if you had one guy preaching the God of Jesus, exclusivity, and one guy preaching the God of Artemis or Ares, whoever it is, then and both people were equally successful, each person got 150 converts, then paganism lost 150 converts to Christianity, and they gained no new converts because they were already pagan. And so his point is like, see, Christianity grew because of the exclusivity, because of the threat of hell. It was really, and you just pause and say, well, is it likely that people would have deferred to a God above Caesar, not pagan, exclusivity in a culture that valued plurality? Like it just doesn't make sense that would have been the thing that blossomed. And so one thing that comes to my mind, Chris, as we're just talking about the nature of some of these ideas is how some of these ideas feel a little bit like how gossip works.
Sure, absolutely.
I think the proverb, chapter 16, says that a whisperer separates close friends. And the idea, and this, like if you plant...
ASMR videos destroy relationships, right?
And so if I just go to my wife and say, Chris talks a lot.
That's true, I do.
And then I just leave it there. It's like, what is she going to think about the next time she's around you? Even if you're talking a normal amount. It's like
shut your trap,
talk,
Tillman.
right? There's a way in which we can plant gossip or slander in someone else's mind, and it changes how they think. It changes how they view other people, and it's really insidious in that way that we just say like, oh, I was just telling you something. I wasn't really trying to ruin Chris, but the effect of it is this little whisper lingers in our mind, and it does change how we see things.
Yep.
I find that some of the things that Ehrman and Bauer are saying are a little bit like gossip, where, for instance, we'll talk more about documents in a few podcasts, but he says, hey, most of the Nag Hammadi documents, the Gnostic Gospels, dated to the 2nd century, which for an Orthodox perspective, you go, well, yeah, that's the whole evidence that they're not real.
Right.
That the New Testament is all dated 1st century. The Gnostic Gospels are dated 2nd century. Therefore, we can trust the New Testament documents. Mm-hmm. But here's what Ehrman does. He says, they're dated 2nd century, and some guys even think it might be 1st. But there's not actually evidence for that.
Right.
So he whispers.
Yep.
And I find that some of these historical cases are like whispers. Remember that thing we referenced a few podcasts ago where he said, admittedly, this is conjecture.
Sure. Yep.
It's just a whisper. Like, why would you say something that is admittedly conjecture unless you just wanted to get it out there, just wanted to get it in your mind, just wanted to erode a little confidence? And so I find that as we're thinking about the historical data, we should have a little bit of a hackle raised to say, when is someone just putting a whisper out there? Mm-hmm. And when is someone trying to separate close friends? Right? Any thoughts?
Yeah. I wish that there would be a degree of genuineness expressed on the part of people like Bart Ehrman, because when he speaks and when he writes, what really, I think what's disingenuous for people is to not state their perspective before they speak, right? So as a Christian person, I will tell somebody who I am and what I believe, right? But there are examples of people who do this type of a thing that are not just Bart Ehrman. You think about how the Jehovah's Witnesses operate, or how the Mormons might operate. They come to your door, they knock on the door, and this is what the Mormons typically these days will do this, say, oh, we're Christians. We're Christians. But there's a big asterisk there, because you're using enough language to get people to maybe consider your claims without actually telling them, but we're not Christians in the historical sense. In fact, we don't believe that the church was even a real thing until Joseph Smith in the 1800s recovered the golden tablets. Or the Jehovah's Witnesses, we don't actually believe that Jesus is God and all the other things that Christian people have believed for 2,000 years. And with Bart Ehrman, the idea is basically like, I'm just a mild-mannered individual who's just giving you food for thought. It's like, no, you're not actually. Yeah. What you are is you are a scholar who has spent his career developing an assassination of historical proofs regarding the authenticity of Scripture. That's what you've done. Now just tell us that. Be honest with us that that's what's happening.
I'm here to show you that Orthodox Christianity is untrue.
Right. So if that's his perspective, then just say it, right?
You can think that.
Yeah, this goes on. I mean, all mainline liberal churches that will do this type of thing. There is the PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA. They have as a document, that's a supposedly governing document, Westminster Confession, Westminster Standards, right? And so they'll point to that and be like, yeah, well, we're Presbyterian. It's like, no, you're actually not, because everything you teach and believe is basically contrary to this, but you're using this as a touchstone to try to get people to think that maybe it's like, just tell us who you are, tell us what you believe, and be done with it. And I think that's where the kind of insidious nature of how this operates is evident, because well-intending people, well-intending Christian people, or well-intending individuals who are just trying to figure things out will come to this, and they'll come to the material, and they'll hear this. And I mentioned to you just before this started, and perhaps she'll be listening here, but there's a dear sister in our church who expressed to me that this is what she heard regularly, the Bauer Ehrman hypothesis, when she was taking religious studies classes at a secular university.
Yeah.
And
he's
she
the
just
chair
said,
of religious studies at UNC. I mean, he's a secular religious studies guy.
And so, she just expressed, well, I just thought that that's how this was, because that's how it was represented, as though somehow this is settled fact, and at the same time, mere conjecture.
Here's the irony. The move is those early Christians were just trying to prove that their one opinion was right.
Right.
Here's the one opinion that's right.
Right.
And I was talking to some brothers yesterday, and we were just kind of still turning over the stone of what is the what is the motive behind a lot of this philosophy? And one brother said, well, why is it still called Christianity then? And my response was because the people over the last 200 years that have said, well, you have the Jesus of faith and the Jesus of history.
Right.
Who have said, you've got this resurrected Jesus of faith, that people believed it in the New Testament, but there's really another Jesus behind him. That's the real Jesus,
right.
The historical Jesus. And we don't lose the word Christianity even when we lose the resurrection, if you're that
Right.
Philosophy, because you think that's the real Christianity.
Yeah.
You think that's the real worldview. And so you're not saying, hey, I've got a new worldview. You're saying, hey, those other people are getting it wrong. So that's the great irony here of the Bauer-Ehrman thesis, is those early church people with their dogma were just trying to be right, but here's the right way to think about it. And so it's kind of like an absolute truth, objective truth argument where
there's an absolute truth except what I tell you.
Exactly. There is no absolute truth except for the thing I'm stating absolutely right now. And so just we have to have our hackles up. Someone who's just saying, oh, I'm just throwing out there, they're actually making a point that they're trying to prove.
And again, this is just the point of genuineness, right?
Yep.
Like, let's have debates, let's have exchanges of thought on the basis of stated assumptions and presuppositions we're going to put on the table. And I think that's an academically responsible way to do things. And
do you have a pastoral encouragement of how people in our church can welcome others? It's one thing to deal with the insincerity of a scholar that knows what they're doing, but what about someone who doesn't know what they're doing? They're your neighbor, they're your friend, and they think they're operating from neutrality, but really they're putting forth a position. How do we, as Christians, seeking to correct our opponent with gentleness, how do we welcome them to put their presuppositions on the table?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, when there was a helpful section to the end of one of John Frame's apologetics books where he goes through a sample conversation, like on an airplane, and how you do this. And, you know, John Frame, one of the things I really appreciate, he's a very winsome man in how he communicates apologetics. And over the years, I've encountered different ways people approach apologetics. Some people are very argumentative about it in the sense that, like, they go after somebody. You know, it's like, well, let me prove why you're wrong. Let me prove why I'm right.
It's like a wrestling form of thought.
Yes.
Like, I will pin you down.
Yes.
You
Until
will
you
cry
submit.
mercy or uncle.
Exactly. Yeah, tap out. And so, you know, there may be a few people that's what they want to do.
Right.
You know, some people may like really just want to wrestle through it because that's how they operate as people. Majority of people don't do that, though. Majority of people are absorbing in the culture the things that they're hearing. They're you know, maybe this kind of dates us a little bit. But, you know,
I don't want to date you.
No, I will. Yeah. Thank you. So, you know, I remember watching, you know, like Larry King having on different, quote, faith leaders, and they would discuss things as far as like the historicity of Jesus's resurrection and this kind of thing. And so these people would have credentials, and you would absorb the information and say, okay, well, so-and-so said, and that might be the only touch point somebody has to what argumentation looks like for historical claims. So to those individuals, it's just to say, can you help me understand why you believe what you do? And I think John Frame did a great job of that when he goes through what's, I think, a very effective method, presuppositionalism, an apologetic method, which is putting your cards on the table and helping other people put their cards on the table, and just peeling back the layers to understand, why do you believe what you believe? On what basis do you believe it? And understand that everybody's going to have beliefs that are based on a commitment, right? A prior commitment somewhere. Yeah. And to talk to a neighbor and say, why do you believe that? And I think
that sounds like it takes a lot of humility and restraint in a reactionary culture to even just plan to say, I'm gonna dig in and help. I mean, you use the word help. Do we think about that? Apologetic. I want to help them. If I believe that their thought is inconsistent and ultimately damning if it leads away from Christ, could I help them think?
Right.
Like, that's a whole different heart posture towards correction other than just arguing. Because oftentimes when we're arguing with someone with a completely different worldview, we spend so much time setting up and knocking down the pins of surface level issues. Yep. And we just dance around and we're like, well, this, but no that, but we don't actually get down to the foundational, do you believe God can speak? I mean, whatever the foundational piece is. So the idea of helping someone think is good. I think there's also, in light of the second chapter, it might just be, and you got to do this non-manipulatively, but it might just be helpful to have in your arsenal the question, is that true?
Yeah, oh, exactly. Yeah.
And so when someone says, well, the scriptures weren't codified until Constantine in
Right.
325 or whatever it was, and therefore we don't really have any witness to the New Testament, the early church before the 300s, you just say, is that true?
Right.
Because what's happening in a lot of these historical sites that Walter Bauer, we've talked a lot about Ehrman, but Walter Bauer is the guy that talked about these 5 historical sites, is if you just ask, is that true, or even is that plausible, is it likely, you get another example of this. One of the historical sites is Asia Minor. You might have heard us in church talk about Asia Minor because we went through Revelation, and all 7 letters to the 7 churches were in Asia Minor, in what's now modern-day Turkey. And Bauer claims that Asia Minor was effectively influenced by the orthodoxy of Rome. So when we see the orthodoxy of the letters to Revelation, there was influence from the orthodoxy of the more powerful Rome. I mean, Chris, Rome was the capital of the empire, right?
Sure.
Now, the one thing that negates is that we're not talking about modern transportation systems or modern information transportation.
Yep.
Rome, in ancient culture, was quite a bit away from Asia Minor. The other thing that makes that claim unlikely is that scholarly dating of the New Testament has all of the New Testament letters prior. I mean, really the only one debated is that maybe some people say is 2nd century is John, right? Some people say that it was like 101.
Sure.
I mean, really close to the 1st century.
Yeah.
So even liberal scholars say these books were written early. Well, if that's true, then you start to ask the question again, is it likely that somehow within 5 decades of Jesus dying, not only did orthodoxy get enough power in Rome, in the capital of paganism, but it got to Rome, and then their power within only 5 decades got back to Asia Minor to squelch all other positions, such that when the Apostle John is writing letters to the churches in Asia Minor, he only has one position he thinks is true.
Right.
So to believe that, you have to say orthodoxy somehow probably won in like the first decade. And there were all these other legitimate belief systems, and they just got squelched like in 10 years, which historically is really, it's not just unlikely, it's implausible.
Right.
And so this becomes another example of, I think, this little whisper, this idea that like, well, maybe it was just Rome that squelched. But then when you say, is that true? You say there seems to be no way that within 2 generations of people claiming to be eyewitnesses of Jesus, that the power of orthodoxy got to squelch all of their belief systems, right?
You know, one of probably the first letter that we have in the New Testament chronologically is what?
Galatians?
Yeah. And Galatia is where?
Asia Minor?
Turkey. Yeah. Galatia is there. And what is Paul addressing?
And if the dating is, if conservative dating is right, what, 51, something like that?
Right. Exactly. And what is he addressing? False gospels.
Right.
Yeah.
So then that brings us up to what the nature of heresy is. I think this is kind of where we can land the plane today. In the next podcast, we'll talk about the early church and their reception of different belief systems, because really Bauer and Ehrman's claims are based on what happened in the 2nd century. Documents found that are most likely from the 2nd century, belief systems that seem to have originated in the 2nd century, like full-fledged Gnosticism, Marcionism, those types of things.
Yeah.
As Kostenberger and Kruger are weighing those 5 cultural sites and whether or not it's likely that Orthodoxy simply was the victor group among a bunch of varied, valid beliefs, they talk about 2 heresies in particular, Docetism and Marcionism. Do you want me to put you on the spot?
Sure.
What's Docetism?
It's the belief that Jesus only appeared to be human.
All right, pop quiz from the Greek word.
Dokeo.
You cannot stump this man. He is
you can.
Jeopardy.
You're just hitting a little easier questions.
Sure. Yeah. This is Jeopardy mind right here. So yeah, you're right. He only appeared to. He didn't actually come in the flesh. He appeared to. It was a really good sleight of hand. Really good.
Ghost.
Yeah. What is it called when your eyes are messed with?
An illusion.
An illusion, like optical illusion.
Optical
right.
illusion,
So
yeah.
Jesus was just an optical illusion. I told some friends yesterday that if you boil down a lot of the Christological problems in the first 400 years, they boil down to the phrase, the Word became flesh.
Sure. Yep.
Was Jesus the Word? Was he God?
Yep.
Was he flesh? Docetism. did he become? What does becoming mean? And so all these different debates over who Jesus was boil down to that one little phrase from John chapter 1, the Word became flesh. And Docetism says the Word did not become flesh. The Word came in some way. He's present enough that you thought he was here, but he wasn't actually here, and therefore he didn't actually rise. Now, this is likely one of the things John is addressing in 1 John, where he says, anyone who denies Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of the Antichrist. He's probably reacting to some sort of Docetism.
Yep.
Now, the reason I bring up Docetism is it helps us see the nature of heresy. For someone to say Jesus Christ didn't actually come in the flesh, he only appeared to, almost mandates that someone else has already said,
Correct, exactly.
he definitely came in the flesh.
Exactly.
Which means that idea, he definitely came in the flesh, came before the other idea.
Right.
Which means the other idea is parasitic.
Yes.
Right? The other idea latches onto, and therefore the other idea had to come second. Now, this is where I think Kruger and Kostenberger are helpful to say, it seems that the very nature of most heresies is that they had to come second.
It appears, dokeo.
Yeah. So it appears, oh man, I'm just using your language. It's like I'm not even thinking for myself. It seems that Docetism has to be reacting to some sort of position that God became a man, incarnation. He was physically killed on a cross, crucifixion, physically rose, resurrection. He didn't just appear to do that, right? And so if that's the case, then you cannot make the claim that Docetism was just a valid belief system alongside Orthodoxy, even though Orthodoxy won out, because it couldn't have been there at the same time. Yeah. Which circles us back to Marcionism, right? When we talked about the dating of when Marcion was excommunicated. Is it valid to believe that a belief system that came about 120-ish years after Jesus died was a contemporary belief system?
Right.
But then also Marcionism, pop quiz again, Marcionism is?
A bunch of things.
Ooh, tell me more.
It's it's basically the separation of the Old and New Testaments. It's the refusal to acknowledge the Gospels typically. It's
acknowledge Matthew, is that right? He keeps like one of them.
It may have been Luke.
Okay.
It may have been Luke, just because of the connection to Paul, because, Marcion was really big camping out on Paul. That was his deal.
Okay, so by the way, if you're a fan of someone's writing, who probably came first?
The person who wrote.
Okay, so if Marcion camped out on Paul, then that probably means Paul had to precede Marcion.
Right.
And so this continues to erode the idea that there was just a bunch of belief system. If we see belief after belief after belief seems to have followed the Orthodox belief, right?
Yes.
And that's like Judaizing, right? If the issue in Galatians is Jesus plus circumcision, well, then Jesus has to precede the plus circumcision. There has to be some foundational, and this is maybe where the next episode will go, is Kruger and Kostenberger show how not only is the early Christianity consistent with the New Testament, but the New Testament is consistent with the Old Testament.
Yes.
And so the historical continuity of the ideas of Orthodox Christianity actually go back to before the New Testament.
Yes.
And that's part of the proof that it's not that Jesus came and developed a new religion. He came and fulfilled scriptures. And that becomes part of the proof when we see what is heresy, what is orthodoxy. Give me a parting shot, Chris. We've said a lot today. Anything you want to emphasize, clarify, add?
I mean, generally speaking, I think it's enough to say that you should use your head. Excuse me. You should use your head to think through claims that other people make. You just should, right? I mean, that Paul commends the church of Berea for looking, with intent into the scriptures to see if what he was saying was true. You and I would invite that. Now, we wouldn't invite people to be jerks about it. Like, please, if you're going to evaluate our sermons, don't come after us and be like, you're terrible. You're awful. What you said was just garbage. I would hope that you would think our intent is better than providing garbage. But at the same time, search the scriptures.
We're just supposed to be average.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to exceed expectations. But, you go through and examine, and I think especially when it comes to claims of significance, if if you're going to fact check a claim that might show up on social media, be like, oh, did so-and-so actually say this, 3 days ago in a press conference? Like, oh, that matters to me. Well, it should really matter to you if somebody's going to make claims about the nature of the Bible, right? Because if what Bart Ehrman is saying is true, then basically everything that we build our lives upon as Christian people is false, and we should just give up, right? I mean, those are pretty sweeping claims and implications. So use your head to think through this. Use your head to think through implications. Use your head to think through the claims themselves.
Yeah, what you just said sounded a lot like 1 Corinthians 15. If everything's undermined and it's
Right.
not true, then give up.
Exactly.
Or in Paul's language, if the resurrection didn't actually happen, your faith is futile, right?
Yep.
That would be maybe where I would end with a bit of, you want to call it a gospel-focused or ideally worshipful aim, is to say liberalism in the last few hundred years when it comes to theology wants to say you can get rid of the history but keep the meaning.
Right.
We mentioned Rudolf Bultmann. It doesn't really matter if Jesus was actually resurrected as long as you believe in resurrection power. You have a resurrection faith. Well, 1 Corinthians says, no, it actually exactly matters that Jesus was resurrected, because if he wasn't, then our faith is futile, it's in vain, it's worthless.
And you're still in your sin.
And we're pitied. Yeah, we should be looked at like, we think the culture pities us for being Christians, but if actually Jesus wasn't resurrected, then they don't pity us enough, right? But if he is resurrected, then in a moment we shall all be changed, and death is swallowed up in victory, and your mortal flesh will put on immortality. Why? Because something actually happened. And it's J. Gresham Machen in his seminal debunking of liberalism says theology equals event plus meaning. And liberalism tries to say you can have meaning without event.
Right.
But orthodoxy says, no, you have to have event, and it has to have meaning. You can't change the meaning of the event, or you change the theology, right? So if you say, yes, the crucifixion happened, as an example, say, no, the meaning of the event is substitution. So you change the meaning, then the event doesn't mean anything. But if you change the event, that's really what a lot of Bauer, Ehrman, those types are trying to do. They're trying to change the event, and Christians have to be brought back to say, no, it actually matters that God became man. It actually matters that he lived and grew in wisdom. It actually matters that his feet traversed real cities. It actually matters that he hung on a wooden cross. It actually matters that he rose from the dead, and he appeared to people, and he ate fish. Like, these things matter. And when you see that a lot of heresies are reacting against those very things.
Correct.
They're not reacting even against monotheism as a...
Or ethics.
No, it's reacting against Jesus's incarnation, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. Because those are the core of what makes Christianity a unique claim. And so as Christians, not only should we be able to defend why the core is viable, but it should lead us to say, this is my hope. My hope is that God became man. Light shined into darkness. Darkness could not overcome him. And to all who received him rather than rejecting him, he gave the right to become children of God, eternal life because he's the resurrection of the life, because he actually was resurrected.
Amen.
Right? And so when we evaluate these claims, we are doing so in order to go back to the simplicity of what the early church united on, which was Jesus is the crucified and risen Messiah, promised in the Old Testament scriptures, who gives life to men.
Amen.
Right? So let's not let anyone divorce event from meaning or change the meaning of event, because event plus meaning is not just academic insight. It is life for the Christian.
Amen.
All right, man. Need to sing a couple songs in response. That feels like I just got done with point number 3 of a 3-point sermon. So hope this has been helpful in your thinking process. We are inching closer. If you started this podcast with us thinking, I really want to know why we have the books we have, we've done a lot of groundwork, and we're going to do a little bit more groundwork next week before we actually start getting, it might even be 2 more weeks, before we actually start saying, why do we think Matthew's a gospel that we can trust? But we hope all of this groundwork is helpful so that once we get to those debates, we'll see why they matter, how they're helpful, and eventually have increased trust in this old book, the Bible, that we love, God's words of eternal life. This is Chris and Josh on A Time to Think.